Okay, so welcome everyone, and a quick note that we are recording and that the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and in particular to the Pamalong clan of the Wabagal people of the land on which the Callaghan campus resides and where some of us are located today. Our presenter today, Ümit, is a historian of the modern Middle East with a research focus on the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. He is currently ARC Dekra Fellow and Lecturer in History and an affiliate of the Centre for the Study of Violence, both at the University of Newcastle, Australia. A Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, he is the author of The Armenians of Aintab, The Economics of Genocide in an Ottoman Province, published by Harvard University Press in 2021, and the co-author of The Spirit of the Laws, The Plunder of Wealth in the Armenian Genocide, published by Berghahn in 2017. He is now working on his third book manuscript project on the global patterns of mass violence in the Ottoman borderlands from the 1860s to the 1920s. His paper today is titled Technocrat of State Terror, Continuity of Mustafa Reşat Mimaroğlu's Career from Empire to Republic. Ümit, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Hello, everyone. And I would like to start thanking Professor Sasha Davis for organizing this series of events and for the invitation. It's actually another book project of mine, which is work in progress. I kind of publish slightly Turkish version of it from a different angle. So recently, it's still a work in progress project. So I would love to hear your comments, feedback, questions, and during the discussion. And also, this presentation is based on the article which will be published soon in the International Journal for the Study of Modern Islam. So, notorious head of the SS Office of Jewish Affairs, Adolf Eichmann, took the order he was given to send millions of Jews to death camps and applied it to the letter. Jewish people were herded en masse onto trains and wagons where they could barely breathe. Every road of their journey was strictly controlled. Eichmann made sure that every single Jew reached the respective concentration and death camps. In his stunning biography of Adolf Eichmann, historian David Cesarani describes him as a critical cog in the Nazi mass murder machine, along with Hitler, Himmler, and Heydrich. As renowned historian Raoul Hilberg emphasized, in a process of total obliteration on a large scale as the Holocaust, the existence of a modern bureaucracy is indispensable. It's precisely at this point that Eichmann's technocratic and bureaucratic mentality, his behavior and action repertoire were essential for the functioning and effective operation of all parts of the killing machine. Bureaucratic desk murderers, Schreiberschachte, like him, play a key role in the smooth functioning of such a system. Understanding how and through what processes perpetrators with such a mindset become cogs in the wheel of extermination allows us unpack the different dimensions of a collective act of violence and crime, such as genocide. The personal, social, political, and ideological dynamics that shape the character and mindset of genocide technocrats, such as Eichmann, their formation and acquisitions play a key role here. Concurrently, these dynamics provide us with important clues and data on how they make decisions and choices at certain stages and episodes of their careers, and how these choices determine the direction of their lives. The historical actor, in the meantime, let me share my screen with you guys. All right. Okay. In the meantime, the historical actor who must be addressed in the context of the Armenian genocide is Mustafa Reşat Mimaroğlu. As a young bureaucrat, he was the head of the Second Department of General Security, also known as the Department of Political Affairs, a section of the Ministry of Interior. Along with other officers in the same unit, Mustafa Reşat play an active role in planning, organization, and implementation of the 24th of April 1915 mass arrests in Istanbul that sparked the Armenian Genocide. As such, he facilitated the work of political decision makers. Mustafa Reşat efficiently handled all the bureaucratic and administrative procedures for the execution of Talat Pasha's decision to arrest and imprison prominent figures of the Armenian community, such as politicians, political activists, and members from major Armenian political parties, intellectuals, journalists, writers, doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, secondary school principals, clergymen, merchants, in short, central actors in that community, and then to kill them on the road between Çankara and Ayaş in central Anatolia, Turkey. His knowledge and command of the Armenian language, the intimate relations he had developed with the Armenian community as a neighbor since his childhood, and the fact that he knew the community in this way did not escape the attention of Interior Minister Talat Pasha, who was notoriously also known as the mastermind of Armenian genocide. Mustafa Reşat followed the Armenian language newspapers and periodicals printed abroad, and when he became the head of the political affairs, he used his administrative and political knowledge and experience to serve Talat, who was already spearheading deportation and the mass killings of Armenians. As he moved up the career ladder as a local prefect, district governor, and then governor, he evolved into a genocide technocrat and put his stamp on the history as the bureaucrat who carried out the roundup of Istanbul's Armenian elite on 24th of April 1915, which was a tipping point in the process of the destruction of Armenians. Mustafa Reşat's actions were not limited to this. In addition to taking charge of executing the orders to send those elites to their deaths, he was directly involved in the execution of Talat Pasha's deportation and extermination orders in Asia Minor. He traveled to Malatya and Mamuratul Aziz, two eastern provinces of Asia Minor, witnessed the deportation and massacres on the ground, and was aware of everything happening. Whenever the process appeared not to work according to Talat's plans, he was immediately sent to the scene by the Interior Minister as a trusted problem-solving technocrat. When he was the district governor of Bolu, northwestern Turkey in 1917, he supervised the forced removal and elimination of Armenians and controlled the entire process. Also, Mustafa Reşat was personally interested in another aspect of the genocide, the fate of Armenian property and assets. He was one of the people involved in the functioning of the abandoned property commissions established in various provinces in Anatolia and responsible for the administration and liquidation of the movable and immovable properties belonging to deported Armenians. Spending considerable time in the organization, membership, and procedures of these commissions, he played a particular role in the preparation of the list of Armenian entrepreneurs and merchants to be detained. After the war, his arrest was regarded as necessary by the Istanbul government and the British High Commission. The major charge he faced after his arrest in 1919 was the torture of Armenian intellectuals and organizing the deportation of the intellectual youth of Istanbul, all Armenian bachelors, and their subsequent annihilation. According to signed statement by Mr. Çakıryan, an official of the Armenian Patriarchate attached to the High Commission, dated on August 1st, 1919, Mustafa Reşat succumbed some of the Armenians living in Istanbul to torture, and he had such influence that, quote, he could arrest Armenians after they had been acquitted by the court-martial. He then had them murdered on the road on the other side of the Bosphorus, unquote. Another accusation against him was that he plundered the property of deportees in Istanbul. Mustafa Reşat was both an ultranationalist and a dedicated Ottoman, and later early Republican elite, bureaucrat. He always fulfilled his responsibilities within the boundary of the hierarchy and obeyed his superiors. As a careerist, modernist, and opportunist bureaucrat who came out of the same school of thought as Talat Pasha, his rise continued in the fledgling Turkish nation-state under Mustafa Kemal's leadership. The opportunism he exposed during his civil servant life had been instrumental in climbing the career ladder one by one. In addition to this careerism and sense of duty, Mustafa Reşat carried out his actions around the ideal of national salvation. He was not a purely bureaucratic executive without personal ideological commitment. As a loyal and fanatic ittihadist, he believed that he was fulfilling a vitally important historical mission, saving the nation from domestic and international enemies. More importantly, he proved to Talat Pasha, the key decision maker of this gigantic genocidal operation, that he could play a facilitative role in neutralizing the Armenian elite and to be a useful technocrat in the realization of the total deportation of Armenians, which required an enormous bureaucratic and technocratic apparatus. Building on his memoirs published in 2 volumes, I probe the course of Reşat's life, his actions and jobs, and explain how he turned into a genocide technocrat. So my main goal is to trace the career of a major protagonist and his decision at critical junctions, and to explore him as an outstanding representative of a category of perpetrators who prepare the propitious infrastructure, ground, and climate for such a large-scale violence. It's important to examine Mustafa Reşat and his actions to place the Armenian genocide in its historical context and to better understand the process by which it was made possible. It is necessary to grasp the administrative mechanisms through which this catastrophe was realized and how ordinary technocrats at the head of these mechanisms facilitated the work of decision makers through a modern bureaucratic structure. This is where both the difficulty and the crux of the matter lie. It seems significant that Mustafa Reşat did not physically kill anybody, nor did he personally witness the deaths of people. Also, there are very limited sources on and evidence of the activities of bureaucrats like him. Given the paucity of other sources, his memoirs form the basis of this chapter or presentation as a document that ought to be cautiously employed, problematized, and critically evaluated. He was at the center of the sending Armenian intellectuals to death. He thought that this was necessary to serve this nation and its interest, and to save it from the Armenian quote-unquote traitors seen as enemies within. So the existence of a broad-based participation in collective violence such as genocides points to the difficulty of people resisting such participation under certain circumstances and contexts. Therefore, the main question here I ask is not only why people from different segments of society partake in these acts, but also how. That is the type, scale, and level of this involvement. Mustafa Reşat's agency gains an important concreteness within the framework of these questions. I argue that the unique organizational culture he acquired in the Ministry of Interior, the Directorate for General Security, and the Department of Political Affairs play a decisive factor in his role in the Armenian genocide. His contribution to, support for, and the actions taken toward the total extermination of Ottoman Armenians suggests a different form of agency and allegiance to the regime. It was not only local political and economic elites or ordinary Turkish, Kurdish, Arab, and Circassian Muslims, but rather bureaucrats, technocrats, and civil servants who were active participants and catalysts of this process, as in the case of Mustafa Reşat. So, it's this. Mustafa Reşat, a relatively high-ranking but still an ordinary bureaucrat, assumed a critical role during his tenure in the Department of Political Affairs. His high level of achievement and his status as Talat Pasha's man, after successfully gaining his trust, made him respectable in the eyes of Mustafa Kemal after the establishment of Republic of Turkey in 1923. Ultimately, it allowed Mustafa Reşat to reach the pinnacle of his career as a civil servant with a senior position at the Council of State, one of the highest levels of state bureaucracy in 1934. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the rank and file of the new nation state were filled with bureaucrats who were deemed trustworthy and resourceful by Talat Pasha, and thus constitute the core of his team. Although his name is scarcely mentioned among the pile of files, Mustafa Reşat's career and the outcomes of his actions make him an historically important figure. A careful examination and analysis of the life stories, careers, and actions of high and middle-scale technocrats in the Republican cadres can tell us more about the intellectual, ideological, and other continuities or ruptures between the Committee of Union and Progress, which was the Ottoman ruling government during the genocide, and the Republican regimes as well. The continuities in the governing leadership are embodied in the figure of Mustafa Reşat, who not only rose through the bureaucratic ranks to become the Ottoman Ahman, but also continue his career as an important member of the Republican government in the 30s and 40s. This despite the fact that he had been exiled to Malta as an exile, and also with the charge of crime against humanity at the end of the First World War I, as such, clearly was marked as a member of the political body that had committed genocide. Therefore, the life and actions of Mustafa Reşat serve as a representative example and provide us with insight that help to better understand the dynamics of the politics of persecution, bureaucracy of genocide, the identity and mental world of the perpetrators under CUP leadership, and the manifold facets of genocidal violence. So, Reşat was born in 1882 in Thessaloniki. His father began his civil service career as the accountant of the military administration in Thessaloniki and continued in Manastır. In 1885, his father was transferred to Istanbul and started working for the palace in the accounting department. Coming from a military bureaucrat family, Mustafa Reşat was interested in the sea and music since childhood. He studied Arabic and Persian at home with his father. And in September 1990, he attended the Imperial School of Political Science and followed the courses of Armenian language and improved the knowledge of Armenian he had acquired when he was a child living in the Armenian neighborhood in Istanbul. After the 1908 Young Turk Revolution and the restitution of the Ottoman Constitution by a new generation of CUP leaders, Mustafa Reşat attempted to become a local prefect and thereby integrate into the new regime. Accordingly, he joined the CUP, Committee of Union and Progress, as a member of the Beylerbeyi Club in Istanbul. And in December 1908, he was appointed as the local prefect of Navraman district of Erzurum province. Becoming a member of the CUP was one of the important stages of his career as a technocrat. He started this post outside of Istanbul in January 1909, and afterwards he was in Kema as a local prefect, in Erzincan in 1910. In May 1911, he became the local prefect of Karaköse of Erzurum province. As in every region he served, he provided important information about the ethnic structure of any place, anywhere he served or he was appointed. So in May 1914, he resigned from the district governorship of Antakya, and he came to Istanbul, where he had come on leave for a family visit. He was offered a position in the Directorate of Political Affairs by Bedri Bey, his colleague from the Imperial School of Political Science and Istanbul Police Director at the time. Kara Kemal, one of the leading ultranationalist figures of the CUP, supported this proposal and vouched for Mustafa Reşat. With his extensive knowledge and factual information that he accumulated, as well as his reports about Armenian activities, Mustafa Reşat won Kara Kemal's favor and trust and managed to get into his networking. The former had a reputation among members of the CUP as an exceptionally deserving and energetic functionary. This is how it was written in his file. Mustafa Reşat accepted the offer and began working as a police officer in the Department of Political Affairs in 1914. In Mustafa Reşat's words, Bedri Bey introduced him to Talat Pasha and presented him as a good, hardworking, and honest friend. The same Bedri, Mustafa Reşat's superior, would be actively involved in the deportation and destruction of Armenians and will be tried in absentia by the court-martial and sentenced to death in 1919. As an officer in the Ministry of Interior, Mustafa Reşat was, in his own words again, engaged in the illegal opposition front. In addition, he was tasked with following and knowing about the behavior, actions, and tendencies of domestic non-Muslim elements of the empire. This specifically refers to Ottoman Armenian citizens. Mustafa Reşat took charge of the Armenian affairs due to his command of the Armenian language. Ali Rıza who had served as superintendent in the same unit, was later appointed as the chief of the Armenian desk by Mustafa Reşat. The fact that he spent the first 4 years of his tenure in eastern regions, where overwhelming majority of the Ottoman Armenians resided, and gained substantial observation and information about the Armenian community, was the main reason that Talat Pasha assigned him to this task. 3 fervent ittihadis, Sezai Bey, Mustafa Reşat's brother-in-law, Talat Pasha, and Kara Kemal, made the biggest impression on Mustafa Reşat and shaped his political views. Additionally, he embraced the unique organizational culture of the Department of Political Affairs, which entail the militarization and regimentation of society, the maintenance of national vigilance, and the upholding of national honor and dignity. He accommodated the anti-liberal, anti-cosmopolitan, and social Darwinist and anti-Western ethos of unionist nationalism, and ardently believed that all Christians had to be cleansed, and a homogeneous Turkish homeland created by emancipating the homeland from Western intrusions and its domestic collaborators. This vision defined the contours and motivations of unionist nationalism as observable in its most horrendous manifestation, the Armenian Genocide in 1915. So Mustafa Reşat's memoirs actually showcase his view of Armenians as traitors who sought independence. They had betrayed the Turkish nation and attempt to destroy its existence, according to Mustafa Reşat Mimaroğlu. He also remarked in his memoirs that despite all the atrocities of Tsarist Russia against Armenians, Armenians changed their direction after the Balkan Wars and recentered Russia's orbit. He argues that the Balkan Wars and the subsequent political changes were effective in this reorientation by Armenian political organizations. While conveying these details, his main purpose is to lay bare the treachery, ingratitude, and disloyalty of the Armenians. In his eyes, the loyal nation of Armenians had now committed treason, turning their backs on the Ottoman Empire that protected and looked after them to side with Tsarist Russia. So his way of reading this part of history is quite selective, to say the least. For him, in the days immediately preceding the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, Russia carried out extremely violent persecutions against Armenian revolutionary organizations, especially in the Caucasus. Many of the political elites defected to Turkey in the early days of the revolution, and the CUP acted in partnership with them against the oppression of the Abdülhamit II regime as a common enemy. However, according to Mustafa Reşat, Armenians never gave up their ambitions in the eastern provinces. Before long, in the period between the Balkan Wars and the ensuing Great War, Armenians approached Russia, which became their protector. Therefore, Armenian newspapers published abroad, and even some Russian newspapers threatened that if the lives and security of Armenians deteriorated in the Ottoman East, Russian army would cross the Azerbaijani border into Anatolia and intervene in the reform issue in the 6 provinces of the Ottoman Empire. So 6 provinces basically became known as the provinces where the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire overwhelmingly used to reside. So his view of Armenians and the Armenian question is in the line with the central political elites of the CUP. Here, he treats it as a security matter. This is the most evident in the context of the reform and directly related to the issue of Armenian population. The first important task of the Department of Political Affairs during the war period was to track down the Hınçaks, one of the influential Armenian political parties, and to foil their assassination plan against Enver, Talat, and Cemal, 3 triumvira of the CUP. In 1914, Hınçaks, under the leadership of Sapah Gülyan, were preparing to assassinate the CUP leaders, who were trying to recover from the disaster they had suffered at the end of the Balkan Wars, before regaining power through the coup d'etat and taking back Edirne from the Bulgarians. Mustafa Reşat believed that Armenian komitacıs took advantage of the defeat Ottoman Empire suffered after the Balkan Wars to mobilize for independence. While the government was occupied with preventing the three key figures of the CUP from being assassinated due to the conflagration of the World War I, all Armenians adopted an openly hostile attitude, and the committees all over the country became active and strengthened the weapons of the people. And with the Turkey's entry into war, they started riots in Van, Kozan, Zeytun, Muş, Karahisar, and were waiting for the Russian army to enter Turkey from the east. This is how he reads this part of history. However, the planners were caught before they could carry out the plan. Mustafa Reşat played an active role in the subsequent crackdown. He was personally present during the interrogations of the captured high-ranking Hınçak members, especially Paramas and Hamparsun Boyajian, which started on August 10, 1914, and lasted until March 1915, during which he took their statements. He launched a major arrest operation in Istanbul, and both those involved in the assassination plan and the Hınçak members in Istanbul who attended the Hınçak Congress in Romania were taken into custody one by one. After the prosecutor's office prepared the indictment, they were put on trial before the military court. Again, in 1915, Armenian political organizations in Istanbul were disbanded and their members were expelled from Istanbul. Mustafa Reşat monitored the behavior and actions of Armenian and Greek population of Istanbul, which was not subjected to deportation, and more importantly, those who were citizens of the Allied powers. His appropriate fulfillment of his duties and his outstanding performance did not escape the attention of Talat Pasha. On March 14, 1915, he was promoted to police chief in the Department of Political Affairs. His rise in the state bureaucracy reached a critical point on June 27, 1916, when he was appointed as the director of the same department. So, Mustafa Reşat was also taking charge of, as I have pointed out at the outset of my talk, the mass arrest of Armenian elites and Armenian political members in Istanbul. So Ali Riza, who was his superintendent, worked under his jurisdiction and listened to Mustafa Reşat directives all the time. And this time he told Ali Riza, I will give you a new task. And he pulled 12 photographs out of his desk drawer and placed them in front of him before giving his order. Quote, these are the most important members of the Armenian communities in Istanbul and also well-known members of the Dashnaksutyun Committee. Dashnaksutyun was another Armenian political organization and party which was established in 1884. Armenian Revolutionary Organization, the other name. First, you will get to know them personally, and then you will follow them. You will find out their places of residence, where they travel to and from, and with whom they come into contact. You will see them closely every day and report to me, unquote. Ali Riza followed Mustafa Reşat's instruction to the letter and surveilled the main IRF politicians, Armenian Revolutionary Federation politicians, writers, and intellectuals who entered and left the building of Azadamark, which was the mouthpiece of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, watching every step they took and reported them to his superior. These reports were the basis for the 24th of April 1915 roundup. Ali Riza remarked that through this surveillance, the homes and names of hundreds of komitacıs who came here to Azadamark within a month were easily identified. At the end of a 3-month investigation conducted under Mustafa Reşat's supervision, the number of the IRF members whose dwellings were identified reached 300. Additionally, the names and houses of Hınçak and other Armenian Liberal Party members were recorded. Mustafa Reşat, who wanted to be sure of the accuracy of these addresses, asked Ali Riza to be careful to confirm the locations, as he did not want to encounter any surprises during the arrest or overlook any Armenians. Any failure to round up those Armenians that were on his list might have caused him to get relegated to a less significant position, and most importantly, to fall out of favor with Talat and Bedri Bey. He expressed his sensitivity to Ali Riza in the following words: "My son, all of these men must be arrested tomorrow evening." He wanted all the arrangements for the arrest operation to be complete by the evening of April 24. For this purpose, the name he most trusted was Ali Rıza. He instructed him to first make a list of the committee members by neighborhood and then assign one officer for 45 people alongside 5 or 6 assistant officers. Ali Rıza undertook the arrest of Armenian intellectuals and politicians residing in Taksim and Beyoğlu districts in Istanbul. A total of 12 lists were prepared, and at exactly 1 o'clock in the morning, the house raids began. The arrest, planned down to the finest detail by Mustafa Reşat and carried out by Ali Rıza, were concluded in a highly organized and disciplined manner. Only Şavaş Misakyan, a writer for the Azadamart newspaper and a resident of Istanbul, was not found at home and thus escaped the arrest. He was searched house to house by Ali Rıza and the officers under his command, but to no avail. Mustafa Reşat insisted that Şavaş Misakyan to be found and arrested as soon as possible and intensified the hunt for him, which went on for a year. Misakyan was arrested on March 16, 1916 by plainclothes policemen under Ali Rıza's command. The former was interrogated in the Department of Political Affairs by Bedri, Mustafa Reşat, and Ali Rıza. When Misakyan refused to answer his questions, Bedri suddenly took off his gloves and punched on Misakyan, slapping and punching him in the nose, mouth, and head, even throwing a chair at his head. Continuing to shout and swear, Bedri ordered Misakyan to be tortured. At that moment, Mustafa Reşat tried to convince him to talk by saying, "My son, why do you persist? Why are you being tortured? Just say what you know and to be done with it. What good does it do to deny when the evidence is clear?" Torture under the supervision of Ali Rıza and Harutyun Mgrdityan, interestingly enough, an Armenian intelligence officer working for Mustafa Reşat, Misakyan describes the horror he experienced in the following words in his memoirs. "At that moment, they knocked me down. One policeman pressed on my chest and 2 policemen grabbed my feet, if you can believe it. The wound came down to 10, 20, 50 times. I was moaning in pain, wailing and writhing. A policeman pressed my mouth with his shoe so I wouldn't make a sound. They realized I was going to faint completely, so they started sprinkling water. They reinforced the handcuffs and tightened the rings on my fingers again and again, so much so that my fingernails were sticking out. Then they took me by the arms and pulled me to my feet. Could I stand? My feet were swollen, twisted, and burning from the beatings." Unquote. After being repeatedly tortured under the orders of Mustafa Reşat, Misakyan found the solution by throwing himself down to the stairs of the political unit, in other words, committing suicide. He lay unconscious in the hospital for a long time. So, detained Armenian intellectuals were interrogated by the police. During these interrogations, they were tortured under the instruction and supervision of Mustafa Reşat. After their interrogations were completed, he again oversaw the operation to send them to Ayaş and Çankırı. Almost all of the prominent intellectuals and politicians of the Armenian community were killed near those places. Those who managed to survive were later deported to Syria, while others escaped. Everything that happened in Ayaş and Çankırı was reported to Mustafa Reşat in cipher telegrams. Until mid-1917, Mustafa Reşat, in tandem with the superintendent Ali Rıza, sent many Armenians into desert with arbitrary arrests and unfounded accusations that would end in death. Although he was working in Istanbul, he also spent as much as time necessary on deportations. Sabit Bey, the governor of Mamurütülaziz, informed Talat Pasha that despite many notifications, there were still Armenians in the district of Malatya who had not been deported, and that the officials involved in this matter were neglecting their duties. In response, Talat sent one of his most reliable bureaucrats, Mustafa Reşat, to Malatya on August 24, 1915, to investigate the matter in person. In mid-October 1916, Talat Pasha sent Mustafa Reşat to Vienna with the Directorate for General Security to acquire training in police services. When he left the Department of Political Affairs in 1917, he handed off profiles residences, and other information of 2,000 people he deemed suspicious to his successor. These files, which he described as works of serious labor, in his own words, were allegedly destroyed by Greek and Armenian committee members during the armistice in 1918. So he stated that when he was appointed to the district governorship of Aydın in July 1917, he left the police force. He submitted a regular collection of papers and records to the Director of General Security, but all of them were wiped out in late 1918. This is his claim. Shortly after Aydın, in late December 1917, he became the district governor of Bolu. After the Mondros Armistice of October 1918, he was appointed as governor of Sinop. Shortly after the war, one of the first actions taken by the new Istanbul government was the initiation of legal proceedings against the members of the CUP involving the deportations, Armenian massacres, and looting. Mustafa Reşat was one of those arrested as the former district governor of Bolu on March 16, 1919. The charges he faced were directly supervising the work of torturing and robbing the Armenians who were gathered in Istanbul and to send to exile to be, for the most part, massacred on the highways of Anatolia. Immediately after his arrest, he was sent to Director of General Security for interrogation. During his interrogation, he strenuously downplayed his actions in the Department of Political Affairs by saying Department of Political Affairs was not as high a position as the Directorate for Political Affairs in the Foreign Ministry. It was only the head of the department in the General Directorate, unquote. Yet, his self-exculpation came to naught. Mustafa Reşat, who did not want to be deported to Malta, as a last resort, contacted Avedis Nakasyan. Avedis Nakasyan, he was an Armenian physician whom he had arrested on 24th of April 1915 by Mustafa Reşat's order. Claiming that it was Mustafa Reşat who rescued Avedis Nakasyan from Ayash, he asked Nakasyan to testify on his behalf. Nakasyan refused his request, saying that what he had done was not important to him because the people he had caused to be killed were much more valuable than him. In fact, in the words of Shavash Misakyan, it will be a crime to forgive the wanton annihilation of more than 150 intellectuals, a generation of 50 years, of which Mustafa Reşat was the leading spirit and the organizer. Reşat's responsibility is no less than that of Talat, Cemal, Bedri, and Dr. Nazım, etc. Unquote. On May 31st, 1920, Mustafa Reşat was taken aboard the battleship Emperor of India and exiled to Malta, along with 10 other perpetrators. They were classified as prisoners of war in Malta. In November 1921, with the intervention of the Ankara government, Mustafa Reşat was released from Malta. Returning to Istanbul from exile, he traveled to İnebolu and from there to Ankara through the unionist Karavasif, one of the founders of the Outpost Society, which was a clandestine intelligence and resistance organization in Istanbul, and began to work for the government of the Grand National Assembly in Istanbul under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal. So he joined the Kemalist National Forces. After arriving in Ankara, he was appointed governor of Tokat and began duty in November 1921. He resigned from there in 1922 and appointed as Turkish history and geography teacher at high school. He quit it in March 1923 and engaged in trade for a while. However, his civil service life took precedence and he was appointed as a second-class civil inspector in Diyarbakır. Diyarbakır is one of the well-known cities in southeastern part of Turkey. So, as a civilian bureaucrat, working in different geographical regions of the empire, especially in the eastern provinces, he was completely familiar with the topography, socioeconomic structure, and ethnic sectarian configuration of the cities, towns, and villages he was assigned. He depicts these regions as places where the government's influence did not penetrate and places that need to be developed, made prosperous, quote-unquote rehabilitated, and civilized. So based on the topographic and cartographic information he collected, he made the neighborhoods, streets, centers, and alleyways and districts in these areas visible, accessible, and manageable for the military and police forces operating there in late 1920s and early 30s. It's worth noting that the general inspector of this period in 1930s, in late 1930s in Turkey, he supervised the rehabilitation efforts in the backward regions of the country in their eyes, who were closely concerned with the Kurdish question and worked for the establishment of an organized bureaucratic network as well as centralized state power and authority throughout the country. They benefited from and were inspired by Mustafa Reşat Mimaroğlu's work and reports. The colonial outlook of the political and administrative rank and file of the new republic towards the region transforms its geography into a space that had to be subjugated and conquered. So the bureaucratic and administrative pillars of this internal colonialist approach to the region, actually this is a significant part of the late 19th century Ottoman discourse as well, were formed by Mustafa Reşat's quasi-colonial and imperialist perspective on the Kurds and his reports on the provinces of the East to the Minister of Interior under the Republican rule. So he was, after his civil inspectorate, he was appointed as governor of Zonguldak in 1924, and then 1926 another governorship, and 1927 he was elected as the head of the first chamber of the Council of State, and in 1934 he climbed perhaps to the highest echelon of his civil service career and became the president of the Council of State. He was finally rewarded for all these years of service to the state. Keeping his distance from the political controversies probably played an important role in the rise of his career and his being rewarded with a senior position in such a critical institution of the state bureaucracy. Mustafa Reşat Mimaroğlu, a genocide technocrat of the CUP regime, was elevated to the presidency of one of the highest administrative courts in Mustafa Kemal's fledgling republic, and was authorized to review and examine draft laws, rules, and regulations submitted by the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers. After serving in this position for 5 years, he retired from his bureaucratic career. As a civil servant, bureaucrat, and technocrat who was mentally and spiritually attached to the bureaucratic apparatus of the state, he always adhered to the hierarchy of subordinates and superiors and paid the utmost attention not to exceed the existing rules and regulations, and completely conceded his individuality and initiative to the formal features of the state. Disorder and irregularity in the bureaucracy were unacceptable for him. During his term as president of the Council of State, he made important attempts to improve the internal structure of this institution. After retiring from the civil service in December 1938, with the encouragement and support of the President İsmet İnönü, he entered the parliament in January 1939 as an İzmir deputy. And during his parliamentary term, he also served as the Istanbul provincial chairman of the Republican People's Party between 1940 and 1942. Finally, Mustafa Reşat became the chairman of the board of the directors of the Agricultural Bank between 1943 and 1946. He passed away on August 4th, 1953 in Ankara. So to conclude, I am not guilty of any crime. I am nothing but a civil servant who did his duty by the laws and regulations. The above quotation belongs to a bureaucrat, Mustafa Reşat Mimaroğlu, who played one of the main roles in the genocide in 1915. It's also how he responded to the accusations against him during his interrogation after the armistice. Like every civil servant, bureaucrat, or technocrat, he was obliged to fulfill his duties as required by the laws and regulations, to follow the orders of his superiors without question. As Ahmet Emin Yalman, as a Turkish journalist, remarked, he was a civil servant who was not willing to deviate a hair's breadth from the law. Yalman here alludes to exculpate Mustafa Reşat, as after all, the latter violated the law all the time by carrying out mass deportations, torture, or executions. He did not follow the law, but the orders that he received. For him, the honor of the civil servant is vested in his ability to execute conscientiously the order of the superior authorities, exactly as if the order agreed with his own conviction. As Max Weber, states in his famous article, Politics as a Vocation. His mindset did not allow for normative or moral filtering of the deeds in his action repertoire while performing this duty. So, does that make him utterly emotionless or callous human being without a particular ideology or Weltanschauung? It seems to me that he was willing when it came to following orders, as he absorbed and eventually upheld the regime's narrative of Armenians as disloyal traitors, a belief that outlived his arrest and was carried into the times of the Republic when he began writing his memoirs, which has, as stated in detail, chronicled the nationalist activities of the Armenians. Mustafa Reşat made great efforts for the development and prosperity of the cities, districts, and towns where he served as governor, district governor, and local prefect. He was a bureaucrat and administrator who gained a great deal of experience in how the country should be governed. Yet, he was aware of the consequences of his actions, the choices and the preferences he made. He was another extremist and ultranationalist from the team of Talat, who was loyal to the latter and was a willing executioner of his orders concerning the Armenian question. He wanted to please Talat by obeying all orders without questioning and wholeheartedly agreeing with him. In this respect, we can claim that he wrote his memoirs to exonerate himself, just as Ayman justified his actions by claiming that he was simply following orders, while at the same time being convinced of the value and necessity of the actions. Indeed, Mustafa Reşat perceived moral responsibility mapped onto honor, as it was his obligation to contribute to saving the nation. Similarly, Adolf Eichmann took refuge in the defense that he was never an anti-Semite, that his sensitive nature could not stand the sight of corpses and blood, that he was not personally involved in the extermination of Jews, that his job description was simply to observe what is happening and report to his superiors. But that does not gloss over the fact that he embraced racially based, Volkish convictions and was an unrepentant Nazi. It's a common pattern that perpetrators who are actively involved in mass violence and massacres, especially genocide and ethnic cleansing, legitimize their actions in this way and to refuse to take responsibility for them. In this sense, we see that Ayman and Mustafa Reşat, who work behind the desk, developed similar defense mechanisms. What makes the latter, our Ayman, Ottoman Ayman, different from the former is that the Turkish Technocrat never concealed any of his convictions and actions, rationalized them by dwelling upon blaming his victims and presenting their activities as a danger for the state, quite in contrast to Adolf Eichmann, who struggled so hard to hide them behind the image of a solely executive organ of his superiors. So successfully even Hannah Arendt was taken in by his performance in the trial in Jerusalem. Neither Ayman nor Mimaroğlu can be considered as typical civil servants. Ayman appeared on the stage of history as the product of an intense anti-Semitic and paramilitary socialization, or rather, he was able to play his role in mass extermination behind the stage that he helped to establish. The CUP cadres also emerged from a socialization dating back to the years of exile and determined by Turkism, despite the Brotherhood discourse of 1908 revolution. What united Mimaroğlu and Ayman was not only the fact that they emphasized their professional responsibility at the discursive level and completely excluded the concept of conscientious responsibility, the ideological, generational, and professional networks of which they were both a part would develop into long-term networks. Some of these pre-Nazi networks would play an important role in the formation of the Federal Republic of Germany after 1945, but would lose momentum after the 60s and even the 70s. In Turkey, which did not go through a process of democratization like Germany, these technocrats, who were deeply connected to CEP, would find a place for themselves in the upper cadres of the new nation state, of which Mustafa Kemal was the founding leader, and would assume the key roles in the consolidation process of the new regime. So the CUP elite had both a mystical and worldview and almost worshipful embrace of science. This dual dimension was especially visible in the medical doctors of the CUP. Although Mustafa Reşat was not a medical doctor, he was an expert, whose talents, skills, and expertise made him integral to the CUP's genocidal universe. As the head of Armenian affairs, he spoke Armenian, was well acquainted with Armenian life, just as Ayman, the head of the Jewish affairs until 1Z conference in 1942, taught himself Hebrew and was interested in Jewish history. Reşat had the ethnographic and technical knowledge that allow him to master his cases and the sleuthing techniques that enable him to create special dossiers on the hundreds of Armenian leading figures months before the massacres began. He was also familiar with the so-called scientific concepts popularized by biological materialism, biological socialism, and social Darwinism, even if he had not read them directly from the sources. Thanks to this background and these concepts, Mustafa Reşat and his colleagues were able to define Armenians during the CUP period and the Kurds during the Republican era as primitive, savage, bloodshed-inducing feudal ethnoclasses, and Turks as a civilized and progressive superior ethnoclass. So, he was a part of the bureaucratic elite of the Republic. He showed no signs of remorse for his direct role in the calamity that befell the Armenians. In fact, he was conscious and proud of what was done and motivated that he was fulfilling a sacred duty of serving the nation. His memoirs convincingly illustrate his familiarity with the Armenian milieus and at the same time his merciless nationalist ideology, about which he remained unremorseful for the whole of his professional life, even in the Republican time. His life story and especially his post-genocide career showcase that the new nation state, shaped by the Kemalist rank and file, which included a large number of unionists who were involved with the CUP, what I call was a republic of the former perpetrators. So this fledgling nation state and the Republican regime rest on the labor, work, efforts, actions, and mentality of this entire generation of the upper, middle, lower middle, and lower scale bureaucratic, technocratic rank and file. And these figures, especially Mustafa Reşat, were amply rewarded for their efforts. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, Ümit. That was an absolutely fascinating paper. I'd like to open the floor for questions. And I might leap in first and ask, I'm really taken by the extent to which Reşat was familiar with the Armenian language, with Armenian culture, which you've sort of brought out. Can you say something about the status of Armenian in the empire, and I mean, how unusual was he in being able to in having this sort of level of knowledge?
Thank you so much for your question, dear Sasha. Until actually the late 19th century, Armenian situation in the empire, I mean, could be regarded as you know, not harmful or not disrespectful. They were known as the loyal nation, Milleti Sadıka, in the eyes of the empire, in the eyes of the Sultan. But the situation of the Ottoman Armenian change, especially after the 1878 Berlin Treaty. In this treaty, of course, the Armenian population was so diversified. There were Armenian political organizations. There were also classes which attached to the empire, Sultan, which attached to the palace as well. And there were internal frictions and fractures within the Armenian community as well. But in 19th century, we can talk about a political society, Armenian political society, and very diversified, very fragmented politically and ideologically speaking. And they created their own political organizations. and they demanded for reforms because the situation of Ottoman Armenians, especially in eastern provinces, were under peril. They were exposed to double taxation and encroachments of the Kurds and Circassians living in the same region. They were always appealing to the Sultanate, but the Sultan, all these appeals went unheeded. And then they preferred to appeal to the European powers, great powers, to press Ottoman Sultan to fulfill the reform agreements. And the Sultan, of course, were stubborn to not fulfill it. And when Armenian political parties, when their demands were met, and when they addressed to the European powers, that of course, I mean, that angered the Ottoman Sultan. As you know, in 1894 and 97, there were a series of massacres in the eastern provinces, and these massacres were now known as Hamidian massacres. But when we look at the bureaucracy, state bureaucracy, we could see numerous well-educated, high-trained Armenians living for the translation room of the palace, for instance, and there were Armenian diplomats, there were Armenian political, they were deputies in the Ottoman Assembly, there were even ministers in the Ottoman cabinet. But this, and also in Istanbul, Armenians and Muslims, they were living together, they were socially and ideologically infused with one another, socialized with one another. But all this situation start to deteriorate during the Hamidian period in late 19th century.
Thank you. But I was sort of wondering about something slightly different, which is how widespread was it for people who were not Armenian to speak Armenian, to be able to read Armenian? Was it a prominent language within the empire, or was it a relatively marginalized language?
Oh, yeah, excellent question. Yeah, thank you for raising this issue. Ottoman Army, Mustafa Reşat's case, of course, was exceptional in that sense, because he was he used to live in an Armenian neighborhood in Istanbul, and he had his family had Armenian neighbors, so he started listening to Armenian conversation, Armenian words, for, when during his childhood. But as I said, he was graduated from the Imperial School of Political Science. Armenian, it was a free elective course, so to speak. If you want to be like a governor or district governor, you will go to this Imperial School of Political Science. If you want to learn Persian, you can take a Persian course, Arabic course, and Armenian another course. So it wasn't that weird or bizarre for an Ottoman bureaucrat to be able to learn Armenian.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions?
I have a question, Sasha.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah,
Please.
hi. Look, great talk, Ümit. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Kit.
My question is, how industrialized was the killing? I mean, it's 1915, so it's not as technologically advanced as what happened under the Nazis. But you mentioned, I mean, were trucks used, and were people just sort of marched out of the major cities and just shot in the fields, or how organized was it on that level? Because of course Eichmann was very good with the trains and organizing everything. I was just wondering, in 1915, are there sort of comparisons, if you could talk more about that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's a great question. Actually, we in order to answer this question properly, we should look at case by case, and we should really look at the regions, because we are not talking about only one genocide. We are talking about micro and micro genocides in different regions, in different parts of Anatolia or Asia Minor. When we talk about eastern provinces, you could see every single possible form of physical violence in the eastern provinces. Armenian able bodies, they were rounded up, and they were told to like the police units for interrogation, but actually they were shot on the site. Armenian able bodies, and also other sheer physical violence was exerted on Armenian men and also children above 12 years old, and the sexual violence was rampant. But I'm talking about the eastern provinces, because when people heard the deportation orders in eastern provinces, they were not taken to the deportation roads by train or by wagons. They were forced to death marches, actually. So also on the roads, they were attacked by irregular forces, banditries and gangs, and also both Turkish and Kurdish security escort. They condone all these activities. In some occasions, they also actively involve and participate in the destruction of Armenians. On the deportation roads, again, for the Armenians from eastern provinces, systematic rape, systematic violence was carried out. And also in the camps, in the concentration camps, we can describe them as such as well. It was not as industrialized as is in the Holocaust. I mean, as you can imagine. But Armenians, for instance, they were sent to the labor battalions, and in these labor battalions, they were forced to work, without any procurement, any provision, and anything. So these people also were they were left to die, and famine was another tool to let these people kill, rather than costing the bullets or other killing tools. They created the famine itself. Famine was rampant in Greater Syria back then. It was a widespread problem anyway. But there were some cases, also Ottoman governors, district governors, they aggravated the famine. Although they had procurement, they created this famine for people to die as well. Out of epidemics were also rampant as well. So they didn't take any precautions. So they created deportation circumstances for deportees to let them die on the deportation roads, rather than physically killing them, rather than expending or spending any army procurements and so forth. But in the case of, for instance, Cilicia region, I'm talking about cities in the southeastern provinces of Asia Minor, stretching from southeastern part to East Mediterranean as well. Deportations were quote unquote were milder than the eastern what was happening in the eastern provinces, because there were two train stations in this region. So these train stations were used by the Ottoman authorities, and there were also more lenient governors who were leading and the way in which these regions were under that kind of the jurisdiction of that kind of district governors and governors. So Armenians, including, for instance, Armenians in my hometown, Aintab, so these deportees were not subject to mass killings on their road to the train station. They were secured by the Ottoman military officers, and then they set their tents for a couple of days to wait for train to be deported to concentration camps in Greater Syria, and precautions were also were taken in those regions, because also there were German journalists and German missionaries in those regions, and they were kind of scared of being recorded, their activities.
Thank you. Great.
I think we have a question from Libby.
Yeah, hi Umit, and I know I've gone over time, so let me try and be quick with this. I just wondered, so there is this compelling argument that you and other scholars are making, I think, about the way that the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust can be sort of productively understood comparatively, because it shows up things in each instance. But I know we've talked about this, but I wondered if you wanted to briefly comment on whether you think there are other instances of genocide or proto-genocides where you think there are similarities or there's a useful comparison, either in like colonial context. I know we've talked a little bit about some of the NKVD perpetrators, sort of in that idea of pinning down the perpetrator. But yeah, just briefly, I wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Great question. I think there are there is enough room for scholars and historians of mass violence, genocides, or Holocaust or other genocides to compare and contrast, drawing parallels between the Armenian case and the Holocaust, Armenian case with the Yugoslavian case and Cambodia, Rwanda, and etc. For instance, when you look at the property regimes of first of all, it's a colonial story. My story has no different from that because it's a story from empire to nation state. In that sense, it's the main ground for making or drawing parallels and so forth. But when you compare the property rules and regulations, legal mechanisms, statutes of laws of Ottoman ruling party CUP to confiscate and liquidate Armenian movable and immovable properties. I'm not here talking about any physical violence. I'm not talking about any mass violence or collective violence. I'm trying to look at the issue from a different perspective to show the intent to destroy in the eyes of Ottoman elites towards Armenians. When you look at the rules and regulations which were issued by the CUP government for confiscating and liquidating the Armenian properties under the veneer of legality, there were many similarities between these rules and regulations and the rules and regulations issued during the Nazi Germany. And another comparison can be made regarding exactly the same subject matter between the Ottoman Empire and the Tsarist Russia during the war. Because when you look at the rules and regulations for confiscation of the enemy aliens properties or non-Russian enemy alien citizens of Tsarist Russia, their property regulations and liquidation laws and even the temporary deportation law were like carbon copies of one another. So I think we need more comparative studies in this field, I would say.
This has been absolutely fascinating, but I am conscious that of the time. So please join me in thanking Ümit for an absolutely fascinating paper.
Thank you so much.
That was excellent. Just before you go, a quick note that our next paper will be on Friday, March the 22nd at our usual starting time of 10 a.m. And our presenter will be Professor Deborah Oxley, presenting on the biological consequences of European imperialism in Southern Africa. And we hope to see you there then.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. See you soon.